that has this same kind of pattern. And it focuses, though, more specifically on those that are called into some sort of responsibility or leadership. And we looked at the passage that precedes it. So go to Luke chapter 12. And we looked at this in our first session when we talked about that instant joy or instant blessedness in co-working with God. We looked at verses 35 through 40. Okay, so this is the parable where well-being, blessedness, joy comes paradoxically when what we're scanning for is this opportunity to work with God. And so when that shows up, even at inopportune times, middle of the night, and so, but we join in, we experience well-being because paradoxically, in co-working with God, even though we're geared to serve, when the Lord shows up in that moment that He's arranged to work with us, He's actually shown up to serve also. And so He takes care of us as we work with Him, right? And so that's the picture that you get in 35 through 40. But now, in verse 41, Peter says, Lord, are you addressing this parable to us, the 12, or to everyone else also? Like, who are you talking to in this? And so the Lord then responds to him, and He says, okay, let's talk about stewardship. All right, let's talk about those that are called into special roles of responsibility. And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and sensible steward, whom his master will put in charge of his servants and to give them their rations at the proper time? Blessed, well off, right, is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he'll put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, and eat and drink, get drunk, the master of that slave will come at a day when he does not expect, at an hour he does not know, and he'll cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers, or you could translate this, the disloyal. Okay, it's clear that this is Jesus now applying this pattern, this general kind of pattern of co-working with God and what happens when we do or do not pay attention, okay, long term, to those who are in some kind of role of responsibility. Okay, so and that's all of us in one way or another here, pretty much, or most at least, and so He sets it up, who's the one He's put in charge to take care of other people. So there's this charge of taking care of others. That's an ongoing way of working. And He says, blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Okay? So there's, in this faithfulness, there's an experience of well-being, of just, it's a task that's given. I know that the Lord has set this up. I know that this is mine to do. And so in that co-working with God, there's a blessedness. I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I am where I'm supposed to be. Okay? There may be pain, all of that, but there's blessedness in it. Okay? Now, notice, and this is the element that comes in that's different, I think, but significant. When the master shows up, he experiences the joy, but he has this increase in opportunity. He says, truly I say to you, he'll be put in charge of all of his possessions, all the master's possessions. In other words, what he's describing here, if this is a description of co-working with God, is that through this attentive, faithful service, there's a pattern where it begins to open up more opportunities. Now, we just suggest there are this pattern that Jesus describes is something that we've seen over and over and over again in the history of Christian ministry. Okay, so you have somebody who starts working with God, and because he's working with God, there's more opportunity that opens up. Okay, and so influence starts to grow, and there's blessedness if that continues. And he says, but verse 45, if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and he begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, to eat and drink, get drunk, the master of that slave will come in an hour he does not expect. Okay, pause there for a second. So this again is that element of inattention, or no longer focusing on looking for the master coming, for that door to open, for the opportunity to co-work with God. And once that attention moves, right, once it's gone, I think what he's pointing out is it becomes very difficult to control my own impulses, right? Begins to eat, drink, get drunk, be abusive to others within the project, right? And so he says what happens is if one, instead of going through the moral transformation process, becomes self-indulgent and impulsive and not looking for opportunities to work with God now, what happens is it leads to a sudden collapse. He says, that's where this judgment comes. The master will come at a day when he does not expect it, an hour he does not know. There will be something that opens up a possibility with God that now, instead of becoming that moment where there's more blessedness, it actually becomes the moment of public failure and exposure, right? And so he says, he will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the disloyal. What does that mean? Okay. Again, metaphors, right? Cut to pieces. I think this is very carefully chosen words on Jesus' part. What does it mean to, in this moment of exposure, as not doing what one is called to do, to be cut to pieces? I think he's talking about a kind of internal fragmentation. The person breaks apart. And let me just say, I think that this is something, as I said, that has been seen over and over again as a pattern in Christian ministry over the years. You have a person who has some initial success working with God, and that leads to more and more influence, more and more possibilities. And with that, very often less and less scrutiny, less and less accountability, right? And in the absence of really focusing, maintaining attention on looking for what God would have done in the next moment, that person instead gives him or himself over to being impulsive. And that hurts other people. It leads to self-indulgence. And you can do that for a period of time and nobody sees. Nobody knows. But it's a time bomb, right? And eventually that moment comes where all of a sudden it becomes public. And what happens is the person literally comes apart. And you see this in public failure of ministries. Like literally the person is internally, he cannot pull a coherent personality together anymore. And is distraught, ashamed, all of that, this, internally fragmented, seemed to be fighting with himself, right? And then he's assigned a place with the disloyal or unreliable. Disloyal and unreliable are good translations of apistos, okay? And what it's saying is it becomes public that this person is not reliably there working with God, with Christ's character, okay? There's hundreds and probably thousands of biographies that in which you could see whether or not they're written, right? But of life stories in which this pattern has been repeated over the centuries. And it's actually, I don't know, I think maybe a blessing of God that some of the people that I looked up to very early in my life, in my ministry, fell apart in this way. Scared me to death, because, man, if that can happen to him, right? But that's good, because it can happen to me. It can happen to you. There's none of us that are immune if we don't pay attention and kind of keep scanning to join in with what God is doing as he opens things up. Okay? And so this is that pattern of delayed judgment. Now, he's clear. Read verses 47 and 48. There are degrees of understanding, and with that, degrees of responsibility in which this will take place. Okay? And so, the slave who knew his master's will and didn't get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes, the one who really got it. Okay? But the one who didn't understand, didn't know, and committed deeds worthy of flogging will receive just a few. Okay? So there's justice in this. Okay? It's not like the Lord takes everybody out in a ruthless way, but this is built into the pattern of what it means to live with God. That welcome, everybody can come in, no moral requirement to join in with God. But as we do that, the Lord begins to give us resources for change. And so that's what we've been talking about over this weekend, really, are some of those resources for change. Okay? Understandings about anger and contempt, understandings about distorted desires, right? What it means to use speech well, what is pride and humility, right? That's kind of the center of the moral transformation process, right? And so if we receive that and put that into work, right, in our lives, if we keep our attention on co-working with God as we do that, then there's more blessedness ahead. Okay? If we don't, then we may continue to do some things with God for a time, but there's going to be an expiration date. Simply because our own character will not be able to bear the conditions of working with God past a certain point. Okay? He loves us enough to invite us as we are. He loves us enough to not leave us as we are. Right? But he also dignifies us with the choice. He would not change you without you being involved. Okay? He wants to involve us in his work of transformation in our life. Okay? So that's how welcome and judgment are connected in the kingdom. Okay? All right. Questions, comments?